Hey, all you bitizens of the internet, welcome to Learnabit. Today, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So, I had the incredible opportunity to make a video of my interview with one of the foremost experts on obsessive compulsive disorder, Fordham University professor of psychology, Dr. Dean McKay. He is the distinguished author of over 200 peer reviewed articles and recently wrote a piece in the New York Daily News entitled, "You Can Spell COVID-19 Prevention Without OCD." Why coronavirus prevention probably won't spawn a generation of germ-obsessed individuals. Now, this article really caught my attention, and I wanted to make a video on the topic to help educate people about anxiety and anxiety disorders in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you guys like it. Thank you, Dr. McKay, for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess before we start, would you maybe want to come in and join me?
Oh, yeah, you know what? You're right. It's a little crowded in here. So, yeah, I'm happy to come in.
That sounds great.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me in.
Hold on here. Let me just edit in some social distancing there. And a bit of extra precaution. And there we go. So, Dr. McKay, my first question is why you decided to write the article.
Well, I've heard a lot from people who are saying that they expect there'll be an epidemic of OCD after the pandemic ends. And there are a lot of really compelling reasons why that's probably not accurate. And I wanted to dispel some myths that surround the nature of OCD in general, and also to help put some people at ease about what likely will happen as far as their contamination-related behaviors when we get past this health crisis.
Yeah, right now with the coronavirus pandemic, times are really uncertain right now, and I think that produces a lot of anxiety for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So, personally, if people were able to come into my house right now, I'd probably be very insistent that they wash their hands. I would be very anxious if they didn't, and I would probably worry about whether or not they brought the virus into my house. So, is that OCD?
No, that's not OCD. And the reason why is that at the moment, we are under particularly clear guidance about behaviors that we're supposed to engage in that are designed to contain the spread of coronavirus. One of them is that we wash our hands more frequently and that we avoid contact with other people, especially if we don't really know where they might have been previously, which could be many different places. And given that coronavirus can be in someone's system for many days where they're asymptomatic, these kinds of reactions are kind of expected under these conditions. And that's really quite different than what true OCD would entail, where someone might insist on those very same things under non-pandemic times.
So, under non-pandemic times and during the pandemic, I've been binge watching the show Monk.
Mm-hmm.
It's a show about a detective who has OCD and always needs things to be either clean or straight or just so. And pretty frequently in pop culture, we see OCD portrayed somewhat like this, as being just someone who's very worried about germs or needs things to be just right. And overall, pop culture portrays OCD as fairly harmless, even sometimes helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear the phrase, "I'm so OCD," quite a lot, and people just use it to mean that they're very organized and very clean. Now, is that OCD?
That's not OCD either. And it's a great question. I hear that same comment a lot about I'm so OCD. And people usually, as you said, use it to illustrate a virtue, like being a very clean person or being very organized. The reality is that people who have bona fide OCD really struggle and suffer considerably due to the disorder. The effort that they have to engage in usually for the aspects of their OCD symptoms are so great that it often overwhelms their ability to do other things. So, for example, someone who might be particularly focused on contamination concerns may wash and stay clean to the exclusion of being able to keep other parts of their lives organized. And so the idea that someone having OCD and it being a fairly harmless kind of condition is actually not accurate. The research on OCD shows that people who have that disorder in a genuine way often are actually fairly disabled by it. The World Health Organization has ranked it as one of the top disabling disorders. And so it is really not at all a harmless kind of condition. It's actually quite serious. And I think what people are referring to when they say I'm so OCD is really more that they're so fastidious.
So it sounds like there might be a lot of ways that OCD shows up that I or the general public might not think of. Could you share some of those ways?
Sure. Yeah. So the general public usually, as we mentioned in the prior question, is they usually think of either being very clean or very organized as two parts of OCD, and indeed there are plenty of people who struggle with contamination related concerns, and of people who meet criteria for OCD, about half of them have some level of contamination concerns, even if that's not their primary symptom. But there are other ways in which the disorder shows up as well. One major way involves things like intrusive thoughts, intrusive unwanted thoughts that are really upsetting, extremely disturbing, and reflect usually some action that the individual who suffers from OCD is worried that they'll engage in, but they desperately do not want to have happen. So, for example, some individuals with OCD will avoid sharp objects because they worry that they'll have the urge to stab someone. They don't want to stab anybody. They're actually quite concerned about the well-being of others, but they nonetheless feel very strongly that they may have this urge that they'll act on, and it can really lead to a lot of disability because of all the things they might avoid. The other symptom of OCD that's usually associated with the disorder in the general public is checking. And indeed, checking is a fairly common symptom, but it's not quite the way that we usually think of, like checking the door or the stove. People check a whole lot of different things. And again, the action and the effort involved in going through checking can be really interfering. It could lead to people being late for appointments, late to other engagements, perhaps interfere with the ability to get to work. And so there are several ways in which this disorder shows up that the general public doesn't think of, either in terms of the nature of the symptoms or the severity.
So a lot of our behaviors right now during the COVID-19 pandemic look a lot like mass contamination fueled OCD.
Mm-hmm.
In your article, you touched on the notion of the coronavirus pandemic triggering an epidemic of OCD. Could you speak to that fear that the public might have?
Sure. So right now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have advocated very specific guidelines that we practice in order to contain the spread of COVID-19. One of them obviously is about hand washing. Another is around keeping other things clean that we bring into the house. So right now you hear many people who wash their groceries before they bring them into the house, wash any new containers, any object. People who also then are avoiding contact with other things and other people, like handing their credit card to someone when they pay for an item in a store. If they get takeout food, they'll pre-order by giving their credit card number over the phone. These are behaviors that are being recommended by the CDC. And the CDC, they have links that not only give you right on the front page for managing coronavirus, the list of things around cleanliness. They have an additional link that has called additional hand washing tips. And so they're really encouraging a level of cleanliness that usually is not expected of the public and is usually not necessary. These behaviors that we have currently that many people are engaging in are ones that also many people who are doing them who don't have OCD ordinarily are eager to stop doing, but are doing now because of the presence of this health threat. What's likely to happen is that after the health threat has passed, and it becomes clear that it's passed because of the decline in hospitalizations, the decline in new cases being identified, and the decline in mortality associated with COVID-19 over time, that people are going to start shedding these behaviors. People who were not fearful of dirt and germs and contaminants beforehand, but are now because of the current health crisis. The people who are likely to develop OCD following this pandemic are probably in two categories. One, probably individuals who maybe were prone to a much higher level of obsessive compulsive behavior beforehand, but did not yet have symptoms severe enough that led to the disorder. Or they had OCD, but they were basically managing it well enough that they were able to get by. And now this health crisis has exacerbated the symptoms to a point where maybe the person can no longer tolerate it. So those are the kinds of things that we may see a minor increase in symptoms just briefly after the pandemic ends, or minor increase in the number of diagnosed cases of OCD after it, but probably won't be at epidemic levels.
So it sounds like there is potentially an underlying genetic factor or an underlying factor within people who will develop OCD from this, that
Mhm.
this might serve as a trigger.
Right. And sometimes we refer to this as somebody having a temperament that would lead to an increased risk of developing the condition. The factors that might lead to it are not yet fully understood. There have been genetic hypotheses put forth. Uh, the data on genetics for OCD have not really been particularly clear. But overall, individuals with OCD tend to be prone to experiencing anxiety, or many sufferers will say that they've had a range of different symptoms over time that have changed over the course of their illness, and dating back prior to them initially seeking any kind of psychiatric assistance with their symptoms.
So a relative of mine is actually a clinical psychologist with expertise in obsessive compulsive disorder. So what she has said is that her clients actually have tended to do pretty well during this crisis because they've already received some treatment, they already have some skills for coping. So could you maybe share with our non-OCD listeners some coping skills that they could employ to help manage their own anxiety?
Sure. Yeah. So I've heard this a fair bit also, that people who already were struggling with OCD are handling all this pretty well. The adage might be that, they've been preparing their whole lives for the pandemic to strike, and so they're ready. Um, that might be a little bit of an overstatement, because people who are washing their hands in the way that an individual with bona fide contamination-based OCD does, they're doing it also to an excess of what the CDC would recommend, even under these times. Um, but nonetheless, other things that people can do to cope with anxiety currently probably fall in a few categories. One is to remind yourself that this crisis will end. We don't really know when it will, but we do know that it will come to an end, and life will slowly but surely return to some semblance of normal. I know there's widespread reports that it will never really fully return to normal, but I think when people talk about that, they're referring to some broader societal issues, and not necessarily just about our own behaviors around cleanliness. The more immediate coping strategy that we can engage in currently, while we're, let's say, engaged in physical distancing and maybe you're not traveling as much, is to make sure that on each day that you're doing anything, that you do schedule some things that are basically planned. Don't have just an open, unstructured day every day. Um, that feeling of unstructuredness, and especially when people start to lose track of their usual time for waking up in the morning, usual time for going to bed, can be really negative for our mood. And so it's better to retain at least some kind of routine, however modest it may be. um, Included in that list of things that you might schedule for yourself each day might be one or two things that are definitively pleasant activities. um, these can be fairly minor, but it is an essential ingredient in order to cope well with this. The third thing is to definitely manage your news and media consumption. The news can be pretty scary. And if you're already engaged in the kind of safety behaviors that the CDC is recommending, it's important to remember that a lot of the news, and especially the pronouncements from public figures, are probably aimed at people who are not doing those things. There's a segment of the population, and it's not an inconsequential segment, it's a large segment that has an overdeveloped sense of optimism. And those individuals sometimes will fuel an additional level of anxiety in those of us that are adhering to the recommendations. We see other people walking around and not maintaining physical distancing and doing other activities. And for us who are trying to pay attention to this, we see them and think of them as an additional risk to our well-being. Um, so remember that the public officials are aiming a lot of their comments probably more towards those people. And so really keep your news consumption to some modest level during the time that you're uh, spending much more time indoors and at home.
So one sufferer of OCD actually shared with me a very similar sentiment, that they feel like they've been preparing for this their whole life, and it feels like finally everyone else is living with the fear that they're experiencing every day. As we discussed earlier, people often casually use the term "I'm so OCD." Is there anything that you would like to communicate to people without OCD about what OCD sufferers are going through?
Definitely. I think it's important for people who might casually use the term "I'm so OCD" to remember that, as we mentioned earlier, OCD is a very serious and frankly debilitating psychiatric problem that sufferers really struggle with. They desperately do not want the symptoms and are usually working quite hard if they're in treatment to not have them any longer. A struggle that usually requires not only a monumental effort, but a great deal of time, and also is marked usually by a lot of frustrations along the way. And so, what sufferers are going through all year long, we're only really getting a small sampling of it when we think about how much time we have to spend in addition to our usual routines when it comes to washing or taking care of other precautions to mitigate the spread of COVID 19.
Dr. McKay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. It was a pleasure getting to talk to you. I hope that this was helpful and that it shed some light on the way that OCD actually operates for the public.
Very much. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. This is a very different style from what I usually do, so let me know what you guys all thought down in the comments, and let me know if you have any suggestions for some future video topics. In the meantime, please stay safe and healthy. Be sure to check out Dr. McKay's article in the New York Daily News, link in the description below, and also my other videos if you want to learn a bit more. A big thank you to Dr. McKay, and I hope to see you all next time.